In a single 24-hour stretch this past weekend, the sun fired one X-class flare, 12 M-class flares, a strong radio blackout, and a geomagnetic storm that reached the edge of severe. This is supposed to be the quiet part of its cycle. None of it hit us head-on this time, and that is exactly the problem, because the power grid it would have struck is the most fragile it has been in decades. Today, I will show you exactly how a storm from the sun takes down a grid, and why the next one is the one that counts. Over the past several days, the sun did something that space weather forecasters do not take lightly. It stopped settling down. In a single 24-hour stretch this past weekend, our star threw out one X-class flare, 12 separate M-class flares, a strong radio blackout that swept across the entire daylight side of the planet, and it drove a strong geomagnetic storm that pushed right up to the edge of severe. Any one of those events, taken on its own, would be an ordinary entry in a solar physicist's logbook. Stacked on top of each other, back to back, with no real pause between them, they become something else entirely. They become a demonstration of what this star is still capable of. And that is exactly why forecasters pay attention to a run like this. A single big flare is weather. A sustained barrage, flare after storm, from more than one region, over days, tells you the sun is in an agitated, productive state, the kind that can keep producing surprises. This is supposed to be the quiet part of the cycle. Solar cycle. 25. The 11-year rhythm of solar activity we are currently living through has already passed its peak and is heading down the far side. The sunspot number has fallen by about 20 in the last year alone. Activity is supposed to be winding toward rest. And yet, in that decline, the sun just fired an X-flare and a dozen M-flares and a strong storm inside one day. That is the first thing you need to understand today. A calming sun is still a loaded one, and a loaded sun only needs to aim correctly one time. History tells us the biggest storms have often come not at the roaring peak of a cycle, but in exactly this declining phase, when everyone assumes the danger has passed. But the flares themselves are not really the story. The story is what all of that energy would have hit if the timing had been just slightly different, because the machine that quietly runs your entire life is more exposed right now than it has been in decades, and almost nobody outside a few control rooms is talking about it. Let me give you the actual numbers, because they are the foundation for everything that follows. Solar flares are ranked by letter, C, then M, then X, and each step up is 10 times more powerful than the last. An X flare is the top class. The largest flare of the weekend was an X 1.3. It peaked Saturday evening at 2041 Universal Time from a brand new sunspot region that forecasters have only just numbered 4482, rotating into view near the southeastern edge of the sun. That flare came with a shock wave racing away from the sun at an estimated 2,714 kilometers per second, and a radio burst that spiked to 890 solar flux units. When it fired, it produced a strong radio blackout, the kind that degrades or wipes out high-frequency radio across the entire sunlit half of Earth for about an hour. That is not an abstraction. Pilots on transoceanic routes that rely on shortwave, mariners, and emergency operators all felt that one directly, in real time, as their radios went quiet. And that is only the flare. The burst of light and X-rays that arrives at the speed of light in about 8 minutes. What follows a large flare is often the heavier event, the coronal mass ejection, the actual launch of matter off the sun. The flash simply announces that something happened, but it is the slower cloud behind it, if it is aimed at us, that reaches all the way down and does the real damage to the machines on the ground. Now, that X-flare launched a coronal mass ejection. A cloud of magnetized plasma weighing billions of tons blasted off the surface at millions of miles per hour. And here is the first piece of luck in this story. That cloud was thrown onto a track that passes behind Earth's orbit. It is not coming for us. There's no direct hit from this particular one. At the same time, a different region on another part of the sun's face, numbered 4479, was throwing M-class flares like sparks off a grinder. 10 of them out of the 12 total from that single region. It is large, it is magnetically tangled, a complex configuration that forecasters describe with the label beta gamma delta, which is simply their shorthand for the most flare-prone kind of sunspot. They put its daily odds at 95% for another flare and 1 in 10 for another X. And underneath all of that flaring, a strong geomagnetic storm was already in progress. That storm is where this gets genuinely interesting. That geomagnetic storm, the strong storm that peaked Saturday at a planetary K-index of 7.33, which is right at the upper end of the scale before you reach severe, was not even caused by the X-flare. It was driven by 2 entirely separate eruptions, coronal mass ejections that left the sun on the 29th and 30th of June, days before, and arrived over the weekend to slam into Earth's magnetic field. They pushed the solar wind past 650 kilometers per second and rattled the magnetic field hard enough to send Aurora well south of where it normally lives. So think about what that means. Inside roughly one day, you had two completely unrelated pieces of solar violence overlapping by pure coincidence: a fresh flare from one region, a storm from ejections off an entirely different region, launched days apart. The sun was firing on multiple fronts at once, and the two just happened to land in the same window. And that storm, too, is already fading. By today, it has calmed to a minor disturbance, barely a blip. So if you are keeping score at home, both of the weekend's headline events, the X-flare and the strong storm, either missed us outright or are quietly winding down. You might reasonably ask why any of this is worth the next 20 minutes of your time. Here is why. The thing that separates an ordinary week from a catastrophic one is not how often the sun fires. It fires constantly, all year, every year. What matters is whether a large, correctly aimed ejection happens to be pointed at Earth at the exact instant it launches. That is a matter of geometry and timing, and it is not something we get to control. This weekend, the geometry was kind to us. The cloud went behind us. But the same sun that just missed is the sun that will keep firing next week and next month. And on the other side of that, near miss, sits a power grid that has quietly become the most fragile it has been in a generation. To understand the real danger here, you have to understand how something happening 93 million miles away can reach the outlet in your wall. The chain is real. It is well understood by physicists, and it has a name: geomagnetically induced current. Here's how it works, in plain terms. When a coronal mass ejection slams into Earth's magnetic field, it makes that field shake. It changes, and it changes fast. And a basic law of physics, the same one behind every electric generator ever built, says that a rapidly changing magnetic field creates an electric field in any conductor sitting nearby. Except in this case, the conductor is not a coil of wire in a machine. It is the ground beneath your feet, the entire crust of the continent. That storm induces a weak electric field across thousands of kilometers of solid rock. Now that electric field is small. Measured over a meter or two, it is almost nothing. On its own, it would do nothing at all. But the power grid is the perfect thing to collect it. And here is the part that should give you pause. Picture the high-voltage transmission network. Hundreds of kilometers of line strung between towers, and at every substation, those lines are grounded through the transformers, tied into the earth at each end. You have just built a giant antenna, a continent-sized loop grounded at both ends, laid directly across the exact ground where that induced electric field is pushing. The field drives a slow, creeping current up out of the earth, through the transformer's grounded connection, along hundreds of kilometers of line, and back down into the earth at the far end. It is direct current, it is silent, and it should not be there at all, and it flows straight into the one component the grid absolutely cannot afford to lose. The damage happens inside the largest transformers, and to see why, you need just one fact about how they work. A power transformer is built for alternating current, power that reverses direction 50 or 60 times every second. That constant rapid reversal is what keeps the transformer's iron core cycling cleanly, magnetizing one way then the other, in perfect balance thousands of times a minute. The entire machine is designed around that rhythm. Geomagnetically induced current breaks the rhythm. It is effectively direct current. It does not reverse, it just pushes steadily in one direction. When that steady one-way current gets added on top of the normal alternating current, it shoves the iron core off-center and into what engineers call half-cycle saturation. And a saturated core cannot do its job. It can no longer hold its own magnetic field inside the iron where it belongs. That magnetic energy spills out of the core and into the surrounding metal structure and the copper windings, where it drives stray currents that heat the metal. Not gently, but to hundreds of degrees in a matter of minutes. At the very same moment, the crippled transformer starts pulling enormous amounts of reactive power out of the grid and dumping electrical distortion, called harmonics, back into it. So you get two failures happening together, and a severe storm can trigger both at once. The first is physical destruction. The heat chars the insulation, cooks the windings, and can permanently kill the transformer where it stands. And the machines most at risk are the biggest ones, the extra high voltage units above 345 kilovolts, which, as you are about to see, are precisely the ones we cannot replace. The second failure is a chain reaction rippling outward across the network. That sudden reactive power demand and the harmonic pollution can trip the protective relays and capacitor banks that guard the grid, dropping the voltage and forcing an ever-widening collapse as each failure loads the survivors. That is what turns a bad night into a blackout that does not simply switch back on. We know exactly what that chain reaction looks like because it has already happened on a real grid in living memory. On March 13, 1989, a coronal mass ejection struck Earth and drove a severe geomagnetic storm, a full G5, the very top of the scale. Directly under it sat the power grid of the Canadian province of Quebec. What happened next took about 90 seconds. The induced currents pushed the transformers toward saturation. The distortion and voltage swings tripped the protective equipment designed to keep the grid safe, and as each piece of protection cut out, its load slammed onto the equipment still running, which then tripped in turn. The failure spread faster than any human operator could possibly respond. In roughly a minute and a half, the entire provincial grid went from normal operation to complete collapse. 6 million people lost power in the dead of a Canadian winter for about 9 hours. That same storm reached down into the United States and damaged a large step-up transformer at a nuclear plant in New Jersey, and it threw the aurora as far south as Texas and Cuba, where people had never seen such a thing in their lives. And here is what makes Quebec so instructive. The operators that night were not careless, and the grid was not poorly built. They were running a modern, well-engineered system with every protection the profession knew how to install. There was simply no playbook for what hit them, because the threat came from 93 million miles away, moving faster than any control room on Earth could react. By the time the first serious alarm sounded, the collapse was already most of the way finished. That is the mechanism from the last section, working at full scale. And the reason I'm walking you through Quebec is not history for its own sake. It is because every single ingredient that made 1989 possible is still present today, except the grid is older now, the demand on it is much higher, and the spare parts are thinner than they have ever been. The sun has not changed since 1989. We are the ones who have changed, and not in a direction that helps us. Not every region faces the same risk, and the reason is strange and surprisingly specific. It comes down to the rock. Two things decide how hard a given grid gets hit. The first is magnetic latitude. The closer a region sits to the auroral zone that ring around the magnetic pole where the northern and southern lights appear, the more violently its local magnetic field swings during a storm, because that is exactly where the storm's electrical currents flow strongest overhead. The second factor is what the grid is built on top of. Where the ground is made of hard, ancient, electrically resistant rock, the granite shields of Canada, the northeastern United States, Scandinavia, the British Isles, the induced current cannot flow easily through the Earth itself, so it does the next best thing available to it. It climbs up into the grid because the metal of the transmission lines is a far easier road than the resistant stone underneath. In other words, the exact regions built on old, hard rock end up funneling the storm's energy directly into their transformers, concentrating it in the most vulnerable equipment they own. And there is one more multiplier. The longer the transmission line, the larger the voltage the storm can build up across it, end to end. So a continent wired together with long, high-voltage lines strung across ancient, resistant rock is, from the sun's point of view, an almost perfect machine for collecting a solar storm and delivering it straight to the transformers. That description is not some far-off place. That description is North America. That is the grid we are talking about. And it brings us to the real core of the problem, which is that the very machines in the line of fire are the ones we cannot get back. Here is the fact that turns all of this from a blackout into a genuine emergency, and it is the center of why the grid is so fragile right now. The giant transformers at the middle of this story cannot be replaced quickly. They are not spare parts sitting in a warehouse. Each one is custom engineered for its specific spot in the network. Each one weighs between 100 and 400 tons. Each one costs millions of dollars. And historically, the United States has imported around 80% of these large units from overseas. The lead time to build and deliver a new one runs from 12 to 24 months. And that is in a normal year, with a normal queue and an intact supply chain. Now imagine a storm that damages not one, but dozens of these machines at once, scattered across the country, all on the same night. There is no stockpile to pull from, because you cannot stockpile a machine that is built bespoke for one single location. That 2-year queue would stretch from months into years, and you cannot simply order the factories to work faster. There are only a handful of manufacturers on the entire planet capable of building the very largest units. The whole world draws from that same small pool, and a global disaster would put every damaged country in line at the same time, all competing for the same limited output. The wait would not be measured in months. For the hardest hit regions, it could be the better part of a decade. This one bottleneck is the single fact that could turn a solar storm from a 9-hour outage into an entire season without power. And it gets worse, because the grid has never been under more strain than it is right now. Those transformers are old, on average around 40 years, and many are already running past the lifespan they were designed for, with less and less margin to absorb any shock. Demand is being pushed toward records by a brutal heat wave building across the southern United States, and by the enormous new electricity appetite of data centers and artificial intelligence, which are adding a huge structural draw to the system that simply did not exist a decade ago. A grid, already running near its thermal and voltage limits, has almost no room left to absorb the sudden reactive power hit of a geomagnetic storm. And the same interconnection that lets regions share power efficiently on a normal day is the exact pathway a failure uses to cascade from local to regional, the way an ordinary blackout, caused by a tree and a software bug, not the sun, unzipped across the entire Northeast in 2003. The spare sharing programs, the utilities, do have cover only a fraction of what a severe, wide storm could damage. Every one of those weaknesses is a reason the same storm Quebec survived in 1989 would do far more damage today, not less. If you are tempted to think Quebec was a one-time fluke, the record says otherwise again and again. Go all the way back to the beginning, to the 1st of September, 1859. The Carrington Event, the largest geomagnetic storm ever recorded. Within about 17 hours of a flare so bright it was visible to the naked eye, telegraph systems around the world failed. Operators reported sparks leaping from their equipment. Some received electric shocks. A few telegraph lines carried so much induced current that they kept right on working with their batteries physically disconnected. The aurora was seen over the Caribbean and reportedly as far south as Colombia. In 1859, that monster hit a world wired with almost nothing. Today, the identical storm would hit a planet wired with absolutely everything, and the storms kept coming. In October of 2003, the Halloween storms knocked out power to about 50,000 people in southern Sweden and permanently damaged transformers all the way down in South Africa. Damage that kept surfacing for months afterward, long after the aurora faded. Then there is the one that should genuinely unsettle you. On July 23, 2012, a coronal mass ejection every bit as powerful as the Carrington Event tore across Earth's orbit at up to 3,000 kilometers per second. It was a direct hit-level storm by any measure scientists use. The only reason you have never heard of it is that Earth had passed that exact point in its orbit about a week earlier. We missed a civilization-scale storm by a single week of orbital timing, nothing more. Most recently, in May of 2024, the strongest storm in 20 years lit up skies as far south as Mexico and scrambled precision farming equipment across the American Midwest during spring planting season, costing real farmers real money. That time, thankfully, the grid mostly held, a reminder that the outcome of any given storm depends heavily on its exact magnetic orientation and on the state of the grid at the moment it arrives. Every one of these is the same mechanism from the top of this video, proving itself yet again, and every one is a measure of what it costs when the sun finally aims correctly. So what happens if our luck runs out? If a Carrington-class storm scores a direct, well-aimed hit on the grid we have today, we actually have an estimate, and it is sobering. Modeling from a 2008 National Academies study put the first-year cost somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion, with a recovery period of 4 to 10 years. That recovery number is so long for exactly one reason: the transformer bottleneck we just walked through. You cannot rebuild in months what takes years to manufacture, and the failures feed each other in a vicious loop. Without power, the pumps that keep fuel moving through the pipelines stop, and without fuel, the backup generators that hospitals and water plants rely on eventually run dry and fall silent themselves. Each system that goes down drags others down with it, which is why engineers describe a long, wide blackout not as a single clean failure, but as a slow, spreading unraveling of everything we have built on top of the grid. And a blackout on that scale does not stay just a blackout. This is the part people miss. Everything else runs on electricity. Water treatment plants and the pumps that push clean water up to your tap, the refineries and the pipelines that move fuel, communications, the internet, the cell network, refrigeration, and the entire food supply chain that depends on it from farm to shelf. Strip away power across a wide region for months, and you are no longer describing an inconvenience or a long camping trip. You're describing a modern society trying to survive something it has almost no living experience of. Now, I want to be careful and honest here, because this is where this kind of story usually tips into doom. This is not the end of the world. It is not permanent, and it would not be everywhere at once. But it is a prolonged wide-area outage in a country that has never once rehearsed one at that scale. And the odds are not as comforting as you would like them to be. One widely cited analysis put the chance of a Carrington-class event at roughly 12% per decade. Stretch that over a human lifetime, and it is far closer to a coin flip than to a long shot. We are, in effect, carrying an enormous insurance policy that has never been tested against the size of the disaster it is supposed to cover. So where does all of this leave us today? In the immediate term, the pressure is actually easing. Forecasters expect solar activity to settle over the next day or two. As the most active regions rotate around the western edge of the sun and out of our line of fire, the strong storm has faded to nothing. For this week, at least, the geometry is on our side, and there is no incoming threat with our name on it. But keep your eye on the eastern edge of the sun. That fresh region, the one that fired the X-flare on Saturday, is rotating further onto the face that points toward Earth, and it will spend the coming days turning to aim more and more directly at us. The sun is not finished. This is a declining cycle that just proved over a single weekend that it can still fire an X-flare and a dozen M-flares in one day. And that is the real takeaway here. Not this specific storm, which missed, but the gap between the two halves of the story. On one side, you have a sun that will not stop firing, and that gives us maybe 15 to 60 minutes of true warning when a cloud is finally aimed our way, because that is all the time we get between our early warning satellites parked out ahead of Earth and the planet itself. 15 to 60 minutes to protect machines that take 2 years to replace. On the other side, you have a grid running on 40-year-old transformers we cannot get back, pushed to its limits by record heat and record demand, sitting one well-aimed storm away from a very bad week that could stretch into a very bad year. We cannot control when the sun fires, or where it points when it does. We can only control how ready we are for the moment the geometry finally lines up. And right now, by almost every measure that actually matters, we are not ready. So keep your eyes on that region as it turns toward us this week, and I will keep tracking it right here with you.